You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast starring myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We are recording this for the benefit of my son, Benjamin Jacob Reckward, but we know there are so many great and wonderful Star Trek fans out there, especially of The Next Generation. We've decided to put all these shows out for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm doing very well. This is the second episode of Season 3, and I think, like we discussed last time, a lot of fans feel like Season 3 is the kicking off point in terms of The Next Generation turning into a very high-quality show. Um, I have to say, though, I don't see that in this episode, inside the Ensigns of Command, which is Star Trek Season 3, Episode 2. Which debuted on October 2nd of 1989 with a star date. I always try to get this now. A star date. Oh wait, there is no star date on Memory Alpha that I can find.
Mm-hmm.
Huh, interesting. So, but before we really get into the nitty gritty, I think that this is just a really awkward episode in general. I think the acting down on Tau Sigma out Tau Sigma 5. I think the acting by all of those participants in that storyline isn't very good versus the storyline that takes place on the Enterprise with Jean-Luc Picard and Counselor Troy and William Riker dealing with Shellyak. I think that was actually a very good part of the episode. But everything that happens down on the planet is kind of awkward, and I feel like the acting in general is just not very good. But we'll start getting into it. So the episode actually opens up in 10 forward, where Lieutenant Commander Data is actually going to be joining an orchestral band. I think it's a string. It's a string quartet.
Correct, yeah.
He's joining a string quartet that includes a Vulcan, another Starfleet officer who looks like an ensign, and Miles O'Brien, who is interestingly out of uniform. I think in the only time we'll see him out of uniform in Star Trek The Next Generation, and he's seen a few times in Deep Space Nine, but, this is one of the times where they're trying to show off Colm Meaney as kind of a cast regular now
Mm-hmm.
for the show, so Miles O'Brien starts appearing a lot during Season 3. So, two of the members of the audience are Dr. Crusher and Jean-Luc Picard, who've come to watch Data perform, and when Data arrives, he expresses a little bit of nervousness at their presence because he warns them both that he has been told by his fellow bandmates that he kind of lacks the soul to have a stirring or evocative performance. And they have a very interesting conversation about Data not showing all of his limitations or announcing them for people around him to hear, because on one hand it not only builds the perception of other people around you that you are full of self-doubt or that you may be lacking in certain skills because you are admitting you're lacking these skills, but as a leader you need to be able to create a sense of competence going forward, even though you may not feel you are up to task. In some cases, I think what Picard and Crusher are talking about here is a little bit of like fake it until you make it, and that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of part of what leadership is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was just wondering, you've been an executive in multiple areas, and you've been studying and reading about leadership as long as I've been alive. I was wondering, what did you think of this exchange between Crusher and Picard and Data here? I think it's a really good exchange, but I just wanted to get your insights.
I thought it was a good discussion because um, I think a leader always has to show confidence, and if the leader shows weakness or they become overly emotional about a situation, it will give the people that he's trying to lead the idea that he or she is not he or she is not he or she is not in control, or they're not capable of controlling the situation. And the 10 forward scene in the beginning also kind of relates a little bit to then the situation that Data is put in once he beams down to the planet,
Right.
since there's the problem with that, whatever that type of radiation is that the survivors of the Artemis have adopted to, but the people on the Enterprise obviously haven't. Data being an android, not biologic, so forth, he can go down, and the radiation's not going to affect him. And
Hyperonic radiation,
yes, right,
by
one
the
of
way.
those types of radiation that they just make up in Star Trek that we have no clue whether some of these things actually do exist and some
Well,
of them
actually,
don't.
I
I
didn't.
think.
Yeah, it's made up.
Right.
Yeah,
But
just
I
checking.
I think the educational point, the admonition from 10 forward, ends up applying somewhat to Data being put into position once he goes down to the planet, and he's given the mission by Picard and particularly Riker that you've got to convince these people that they have to evacuate the planet, because if they don't, the Shellyak are going to kill them.
Right,
And
and
you
sorry, go on. I didn't
know,
mean to
and
interrupt.
then Data, kind of goes through a learning process in terms of first trying to understand the humans that are on Cal Cygna 5, what their position is, and he tries to very logically explain. And then he tries to, he starts talking to the
Right.
groups, and Scotiaban doesn't want to leave and causes some, controversy and so forth. And actually, it made me think of, you know, gets to the point of, our current politics in this country, where you have some people are supportive and some people are in the middle and some people don't agree with it at all. So Data has to get very creative and
Oh, well, I
you know,
didn't. Yeah,
and actually
yeah.
provide some, I'll use the term provocative leadership, when he takes part of his electronics and turns it into a phaser.
Well,
And
well,
then
let's save it for the audience there at
yeah,
the end.
yeah, go ahead.
So, well, you bring up a lot of really good points, and one that I didn't even think about. So for folks at home who are listening, Dad and I do a little bit of pre-production sometimes where we talk about the show before we go in. Of course, we have notes that are put together by Dad, who does a really great job with them that help guide the discussion. Um, One thing that I didn't consider when um, thinking about this episode is kind of the oncoming onslaught of climate change. Um, in many ways, you pointed out like something that is constantly going on, I think, in today's discussion, where there's some people who think that, well, we have ownership of the earth, and whatever problem that's ahead of us, we can either ignore it or we'll be able to deal with it before it gets any worse. And then you have the other people on the other side who truly believe, like, this is a catastrophic emergency. If we don't deal with this now, it's going to wipe us all out. There really is no middle position on that when it comes to climate change. In many ways, Data is that middle position in the show, where, like, He's like, look, the Shellyak are coming, and there's no discussion about this. There's no voting. There's really no debate. Like, you have to leave this planet, or they're going to kill all of you. It's it made me suddenly think about kind of the debate we're having about climate change, where, you know, on one hand, yes, there is a group of people who think that they don't have any sort of ecological responsibility to the planet, or that they're going to somehow pull money out of their ass at the last moment and buy their way out of this. Um, on the other hand, I think that there are people who are so um, crazed as our politics has crazed everyone these days that you can't really have a logical conversation with them about how to fix the problem because they're so ideologically bent on rehashing the problem over and over again. Um, at the end of the day, like when you mention the fact, and we'll get there, that Data has to employ some controversial and outright evocative measures to actually convince the people. Um, I was sitting there just thinking about climate change for a moment, and I was like, "Holy crap! Are we going to have to get to that point?" But let's actually get more into the show. Um,
Well, can I comment about what you just said on climate change?
oh yeah, absolutely,
I
please.
hadn't thought about that, but I think you're right on target because, just listening to the news and it just seems like this year, we could probably go back and look at climate related events for the last several years. But if you look at the torrential rainfall in China,
Hmm.
flooding of subway systems, the torrential rains in, Germany, Belgium, that part of Europe, what happened with Ida that came through, Louisiana and then New York, and the same scenes of subways flooding in New York City as you saw in
Right.
China, and then the wildfires and the prolonged periods of heat, which is still going on now, and the weather people say that that the heat's going to last into the well into the fall. I just think there's an increasing incidence of climate related adverse events. And you're starting to hear things on the news on, somewhat, balanced news. I'll say National Public Radio, I think makes an effort to be
Right.
balanced. And there's just more comments from, scientists and politicians that we really have to do something about it. However, I think it's going to take something like what happens this episode, where Data has to be very evocative, provocative, to convince the humans on this planet that they have to leave. They have no choice. I think we're going to have some much worse events before there's a global consciousness and a global effort to say, we don't have a fucking choice anymore. We've got to do something about this now.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. And I think the story here is about people finally coming to the realization that I'm going to say this line here and now because we'll get back to it. Um, things can be replaced, but lives cannot. Um,
Exactly. Right.
I think that's a
Yes.
very important mantra that we should state now because, like I said,
Hmm.
we'll circle back around. So so in the middle of the string quartet's performance of Mozart's Ein klein Nachtmusik, did I pronounce that correctly?
It sounds okay to me. Yeah.
Okay. Riker calls Picard to the bridge, forcing the captain to depart, painfully aware that it appears he's walking out on Data's performance. And, kudos to Brett Spiner. This is probably going to be some of his best acting in the episode. I'm going to be mean to Brett Spiner tonight, folks. Uh, but, he really does have this kind of pained expression about watching Picard leave. And in some cases, I think that this is one of those episodes where Data reveals kind of the father son relationship between him and Jean Luc Picard, and
Hmm.
kind of his real need for the captain's affirmation in terms
Hmm.
of things that he does.
Hmm.
this just gets back to our conversation that we keep having about how Data is already human. He just keeps forgetting about it.
Hmm.
So when he gets to the bridge, Picard is informed that the Enterprise has been contacted by the Sheliak Corporate for the first time in 111 years. In a recorded message set on a repeat from the Shelia system, they demand that a human colony from Tau Cygni Phi be removed, as this planet was ceded to the Sheliak in the Treaty of Armins. They give the Enterprise 4 days to remove the humans. The Federation has no record of the settlement on a planet which is cloaked in hyperonic radiation that is lethal to humans. Picard reasons that the Sheliak are not just calling him out of nowhere because they basically hate humans. So he has the crew set course for Tau Cygni 5. Upon arriving there, Lieutenant Worf detects human life signs, but because of the radiation, it prevents him from determining how many humans down there. As you previously mentioned, Data is immune to hyperonic radiation, so he is able to take a shuttlecraft down there because transporters and
That's right.
phasers are made inoperable by this radiation. Uh, Interesting thing here, and I wanted to get this. I really wanted to talk to you about this because I have no idea what this is from a scientific standpoint. Dr. Crusher suggests that the so when Data actually gets down to the planet, he actually meets the colonists um, almost immediately. They're actually searching because they see his shuttle land.
Hmm.
And both the colonists realize, like, hey, this guy's from the Federation, where our ancestors essentially came from. And Data gets to chit chatting with him, and it's quickly discovered that it's not a colony of like a few hundred people, it's a colony of 15,000 people. And the crew on the USS Enterprise is shocked, but Crusher should, and this is what I wanted to ask you specifically. Dr. Crusher suggests that they may have adapted somehow. Previous research by a scientist named Milan had suggested that it could be done perhaps through extensive virotherapy. Um, so essentially, virotherapy is a made up uh, science fiction treatment in the Star Trek universe that isn't really given any uh, information on what it is. It's literally made up here in the show. But what do you think about humans adapting to radiation to the point of being able to live and sustain a society within, I guess, an area of a lethal concentration, especially if this hyperonic radiation is so deadly?
Um, it's hard to say or give a scientific or logical answer because, as you said, hyperonic radiation and virotherapy is totally something science fiction made up. We have no clue about what any thoughts might be as a scientific basis for it. But I think that what you could consider is I think there's situations where humans can be exposed to a particular toxin in a low dose and their
Hmm.
body can build up some tolerance to it. Now, that's more like with a chemical toxin and
Yeah,
so forth. But here we're dealing with radiation. And the
I would think
problem,
that would
Jack,
be so. I would think that the radiation would, in any case, humans wouldn't be able to survive long enough to adapt to it because it
right?
would literally
Yeah.
degrade our internal organs.
Well, I think the big problem with, radiation, for instance, when you're exposed to like what happened in Chernobyl when those uh,
Right.
emergency people, responded right away, or if there was a nuclear war and you're exposed to radioactive fallout, that if you get a large enough dose, the problem is that the radiation, it really knocks out your chromosomes, messes your DNA up, so that your cells
Hmm.
can't function anymore, can't translate, can't your genetic code's so thrown out of whack that your whole cellular metabolism at the cellular level breaks down, so that then, as you say, organs don't work, your internal systems don't work. So I don't know how, I don't know if there's probably been some experiments by who knows, the Russians, the Chinese, whatever, where they've exposed humans to small doses of radiation to see if they can adapt. But that I don't know enough to say that whether this would really be possible or not. This might be totally a science fiction story
Yeah.
here.
Well, I know there is medication that you can take that can help mitigate some of the effects of radiation exposure. Um, I just know that you have to take it in conjunction of like a hazmat suit. Um, and these are usually people who are walking into highly toxic and extremely irradiated areas. My guess is that like when I hear virotherapy, I think that this is probably essentially the only way it sounds like this works is that these aren't even humans anymore. These Tau Sigma 5 people, because like you said, like radiation really does kind of wipe out your DNA and kind of wipe out your chromosomes. Whatever virotherapy is, it has to be something that allows them to keep some sort of coherent structure to like just their cells, properly reproducing and
Oh, sure.
replicating and dying off.
Right.
So I bet you that I bet you virotherapy is probably some sort of genetic experimentation where they're either introducing something to the body that causes some sort of change, or if not making changes to the body itself. And with 111 years, I wonder if they would be able to create some sort of like generational buildup. Like maybe the first Tau SETIs were like you know, they were dying the moment they walked out the ship. And like the crash ship that they were on, the Artemis, was the only thing that kept that small crew alive. But then they mated, and they were able to genetically change the next generation. Those people were able to go up for like 3 minutes, and the
Right.
generation
Sure.
after that's like an hour.
Right.
Um,
Sure.
I think the idea, and last season you and I talked about CRISPR a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think if we get into genetic therapy and modification, it'll be very interesting to see if we would be able to create something that allows humans or whatever species of human that comes after us to withstand really highly irradiated environments, especially space. Because if you look at space itself, like space is basically a giant radiation blanket.
Well, that's a good point because I've recently read some articles that one of the challenges of interplanetary travel, I mean, even going to Mars, is
Right.
how does the human body survive the level of radiation uh, it
Well,
would be to which it would be exposed.
there's apparently like a Goldilocks zone that we're living in as it already
Hmm.
is, but
Hmm.
it's not very far once you travel out that Goldilocks zone that, you would be heavily bombarded and even killed instantly. It's probably one of the reasons why Elon Musk is having such a hard time actually getting together a crew to go to Mars. It seems like they haven't figured out that issue. And it seems to be a really key one. I think one thing that I remember from this book and TV series I mentioned last season a few times, The Expanse. One thing that they try to do in that series is use alien DNA to genetically modify children to not only deal with like the radiation in space, but to actually endure the vacuum of space, where they're able to walk around in the vacuum without a suit on. Um, but they have to dramatically twist their genetic structure around to make it work to the point where like they're not human anymore. I think
Hmm.
they're one thing that I noticed about like these Tau Setians, they really do have like a reddish hue to them, and part of that is like the staging and the setup and the lighting, but some of it's also the makeup to where like they're very tanned people. Um, I think one thing that like we keep saying human, 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 but I think if you actually had humans go out and do this sort of thing, I don't think that these people from I'm I feel like I'm butchering these Tau Sigma 5. I keep saying Tau Ceti. Tau Sigma 5. I think these people from these Sigmas, I think that these Sigmas are probably a new variant of human down the line, and the idea of them being Homo sapien no longer applies.
Well, and I think we may have touched on this before that if we were able to figure out how to colonize Mars or even colonize the moon, just that our bodies are going to, if we can survive it long term, or our genome can adapt.
Right.
If you're born on the moon and you grow up on the moon because of such less gravity, and the same thing with I saw there was a Jeopardy question tonight that what's the acceleration due to gravity on the Earth? It's like 3.2 meters per second squared. On Mars, it's 1.22 meters per second squared. So
Right.
it's like, one third of gravity. So, just in terms of muscular development and perhaps how bones grow and so forth when you're under, constantly, if you're living in an environment, born in an environment, living in an environment where there's less gravity,
So
you're going to develop differently.
So it's crazy that you mentioned this and that I mentioned the Expanse, because one thing that happens in the Expanse, and I think I may have told this to you in previous, but if you forgot, I'll go over it real quick. So like there are humans in the Expanse, and Expanse is considered the anti-Star Trek. Um, Humans go out into the galaxy and they colonize the belt, that asteroid belt between Mars and
Jupiter, yeah.
Earth. Yeah, and between Jupiter, they even get out as far as Io. They have an Io station out there.
Mm-hmm.
But because they've been exposed to the vacuum of space so long and limited gravity, like they have actually humans out there actually start growing taller. They have longer, weaker bones that are a little bit elongated. And one of the things that is done to torture these belters, as they're called, because they live out on the belt. They are often brought back to Earth and subjected to Earth's gravity, and it literally breaks their bones and it breaks their
Mm-hmm.
skeletons, and it's
Mm.
all because they're just not used to, like you said, that differential, to the
Mm-hmm.
point where Martians, and Martians are their own distinct group. They actually have to develop a war suit to be able to go out and fight Earthlings, because Earthlings are able to adapt to all these different gravities that the Martians are not able to. Um, I think another interesting story, and I kind of want to dovetail, in terms of humans evolving in space and how the big changes might occur. I recently finished a Japanese anime series called Mobile Suit Gundam, which I was a big fan of growing up, especially in high school. And in Mobile Suit Gundam, what they suppose is that with our exposure to space travel and us actually living in space colonies that they call sides, which look like giant cylinders, but inside it's basically a biome. Their idea is that we will actually develop kind of cognitive and psychological powers that will allow us to actually connect with each other on a psychological and almost a semi-spiritual level, and that space will allow us to, in some ways, leave our material bodies. Like that's what the show kind of posits.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think in general, we just have to get past that hurdle of surviving in space in the first place before we can even
Yes.
talk about
Yeah.
what we
Yeah.
evolve into.
Right.
Um,
And and, and and
even
and even before that, we have to survive climate change.
Oh well, let's get back right into the show. So they send Data down, and Data lands his shuttle pod, and he meets Kentor and Heritath. And they recognize that he's from the Federation, and they tell him that this is the first person that's ever landed on our planet, which I find interesting. They know for a fact that they are not alone in the universe. They seem to have some sort of level of technology that is equivalent to at least enough to where they know about androids, they know about the technology that the Federation might have, they know about warp travel, but they've never built a ship and left their planet.
Hmm.
It just seemed very odd to me. They have all this familiarity, but they haven't left. Um, so they take Data to basically their main city, and I don't know if the city was given a name, but they
I
are
don't.
met.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't remember a name being given for the city. Yeah.
but they bring him to their leader named Goshevin, and Goshevin is played by. Let me get the actor's name real quick because I actually liked him a lot. Uh, let's see. Oh, Grainer Hines played Goshevin. Goshevin immediately tells Data, upon Data's report that the Shellyak are coming, and because that the planet is ceded to the Shellyak legally, the Tau Sigmas have to get off. He basically tells Data to go take a hike, and that's essentially what his storyline is going to be from here to the end. Data, I don't like you, go take a hike. And there's a lot of things that we don't have to get into that's baked into the idea of like um, Data not being um, Data not being respected because he's seen as a piece of technology, not an actual like living, breathing being. I kind of want to avoid that for a second and get into kind of the main crux of what Goshevin's argument is. Goshevin's argument is that, the crew of the Artemis landed here, and we survived this harsh, inhospitable environment. And in the process of doing that, as you said, we brought water to the desert. We created a civilization and city here that, should be the envy of the galaxy because we are so hardworking and pioneering. Uh, all of that, as this episode is trying to show, is hubris. And I was wondering what your take is on his position going into this. Is there anything that you can see from Goshevin's argument that is compelling to you or makes any sense? Because I think from like a Star Trek perspective, or maybe from our kind of left liberal perspective, we've repeated the mantra before, things can be replaced, but um, lives cannot. Do you think that he has any sort of argument to um, what he's saying here? That we colonize this place. This is our home. We have a right to stay here.
No, I agree with you that he's very hubristic. The other comment he says, in addition to we brought water to the desert, says several times he said, my grandfather gave his life to build this canal, this aqueduct. It's like, so what? And that's not to denigrate the work that his grandfather did, but in the long term, it gets into the fact that what you said before is that they came from the Federation 100 years, 111 years before. We don't know what kind of, you know, once the ship got there, what level of technology they had, what tools they had to even try to communicate, and all of that sort of thing. So, I don't think Goshevin has any argument because he doesn't really understand the situation that he's in. He doesn't understand he's in a galactic geopolitical situation and that he's really illegally on that planet. And the Shellyak have complete legal right per the treaty to request that the Federation remove them. And if they don't, since it's their territory, if they want to eradicate that, what they would consider a human infestation, they're going to do it.
I think the hard thing about it is, to a certain extent, and I think about this a lot with modern American politics because I grew up in Apex, North Carolina. That's where you and mom ultimately settled. And Apex is a huge town now. But when I was growing up, it wasn't a big town at all. and there were, different. There was definitely a very conservative flavor to the town. Um, However, I now live in New York, which is, one of the largest cities on Earth. Um, Very quote unquote forward thinking metropolitan, very liberal for, publicly at least. And I think what I've come to learn is that the views that I espouse and hold are often not the views held by people who have to live in a place that is not so economically rich, not so environmentally wealthy. Um, I understand Goshevin's point to a certain extent, because look at it this way. For 111 years, he and his people have essentially been alone. Like, there's been no one there to go. Like, no Shellyak have shown up for a century and said, like, hey guys, this is our land. What are you doing here? Like, you're squatting. Like, no Shellyak has shown up and said that. At the same time, and it was really kind of a world building thing that I started asking around the second or third time I watched this episode. Okay, at some point it's pretty clear that the Federation allowed people to like leave the Alpha Quadrant, or at least their portion of the Alpha Quadrant, and go and settle in areas that weren't necessarily claimed or legally held by anyone um, stable, at least to the point where they had to form a treaty with the Shellyak, which means that at some point they were in conflict with the Shellyak. Um, Goshevin's people haven't seen anyone for a century, and all of a sudden the people that sent them out and then forgot about them have suddenly showed up and said, hey, not only did we forget about you, but we're here to move you because you're illegally squatting on land that's not yours. But to Goshevin, when he was born, what else did he know?
Well, that goes back to my point is that, you're coming about having some respect for Goshevin's position. Yeah, that's valid. However, it goes back to my previous point. I think that, on a larger, from a larger, broader perspective,
Mm-hmm.
Goshevin and his people just didn't know where they were. That
Right.
they were in a compromised position. Is soon after that they landed, they inadvertently landed because of a guidance failure. That they were not, they did not know that they were not where they shouldn't have been.
Well, I think there's another part of this psychologically that rarely gets talked about, and I don't think that we talk about it in our country now. And I think we might in terms of Afghanistan later on. I know that we've talked about in World War II, and I know we've talked about Vietnam, but when it comes to like national trauma and how our history is shaped by the trauma that takes place on a monumental level, we can think of like 9/11 or the coal bombing in the 90s. I'm trying to think of like I guess the S&P crisis, the 2008 financial crash, like really big events that cause a lot of damage, but we have to work our way out of. I think it's very common if you have people that have basically forged their way into a pretty good life in a very inhospitable environment. They probably, as a way to deal with the trauma of living in that environment, developed a sort of pride about being there and being able to survive it and being tough, being of the land and being tougher than the land and living off the land. There's this very, I think the frontiersman aspect or the psychological aspect of the frontiersman is in many cases very brave, very industrious, very smart in their own ways. Like, none of these people on Tau Sigma 5 are clearly dumb. Like, they're all very smart and educated to the point where Ariadne, where we'll get into her, but, she's fascinated by robotics, and it's clear that they have some sort of study of robotics in their society for her to have this fascination. But, this is a society that has dealt with so much hardship that the idea of giving up this thing that they've had to tame is probably like a psychological defeat that Goshaman doesn't want to play into.
Hmm.
Because, like, you're always fighting this land to beat it and tame it. And all of a sudden, someone's coming and telling you, like, you have to give up your fight now. Something that's brought you, your psychological and personal identity, your pride. I can see that being very, very difficult for a man like Goshavin, especially if, your father or your grandfather is one of, like, the founders of your society. But I think that also gets into, like, power and how we vest power in society, and this kind of idea we have that, if someone built it and established it, it has to be respected for what it is, and it has to be treated in some ways as sacrosanct. Um, one thing that we talk about here in America, and it didn't pop up to me until I thought about this. You know, Goshavin in some ways sounds like a lot of people I know in the South who complain about their culture changing or people moving in and removing things like Confederate statues. It's part of our pride, it's part of our history. It may not be something that you like, but it's ours and we're going to try to keep it. Um and I think that kind of Confederate history and that kind of Confederate adherence that you see down in the South is also born of that trauma of having lost. And instead of actually dealing with the actual loss and the repercussions of what that meant, there's an entire culture down in the South that's built up this prideful idea that, like, they never lost the Civil War, that it was never about slavery. Kind of all these illusions to just
Oh,
deal with the fact that, like,
yes, it's the lost cause.
yeah,
That's the whole story, right?
well, in many ways, like, that planet is, I think, Goshavin's lost cause.
Hmm. But
Like,
but he doesn't know it until the Federation comes back, till Data shows up.
right. And I think this gets into a conversation I wanted to have with you about the nature of imperialism. Um, you and I get into the conversation a lot whether or not um, Starfleet is part of a greater organization that's a republic, or if the Federation uh, is an empire. And in this case, it feels like the function that the Federation has to fulfill, I'm sorry, is very imperialistic in a way. Uh, it seems odd to me that a society that believes in democracy, they even have these general rules that talk about, people's right to a vote and all these things, um, is so quick to jump to another governing species legal point and actually remove their own citizens without any sort of legal challenge to it. Like, you even mentioned Picard goes there and he's like, we have this treaty, they have to go. Um, there's no real fight about it. And I was just wondering, like, do you think that this episode shows the Federation as an empire, or is it something else?
That's a really good point because I think you could look at, if you look at geopolitically what's going on now,
Hmm.
particularly what happened this week with what the Biden administration did, that has made the French infuriated with us, and and they're, of course, they're infuriated with the Australians also. But the way geopolitics are shaping up is like the Western democracies, who don't always get along, as the French are mad at us now, perhaps with some good reason.
Hmm.
Um, they represent a certain worldview,
Yes.
and China represents a different worldview. Russia kind of doesn't count because I think they're trying to figure things out, like what's going to happen
Well,
after Putin
if
himself.
I may, Russia
Sure.
represents one man's worldview. But
Yes,
go on.
exactly. exactly, very well put. So, and I think what so when you have the geopolitics that I just described, there's a certain political and cultural imperialism there. Like
Hmm.
we're trying to. I mean, look what we just did the in the Middle East with the Afghanistan war in Iraq. We tried to impose Western democracy on these countries that
Yeah.
had no understanding of it, no history of it. And actually, since I've been watching Voyager, I'm on into season 2. There was one episode I watched today that was interesting
Hmm.
where they're in the gamma. What are they in the Delta Quadrant?
Delta Quadrant. Yeah.
Delta Quadrant, and they've come up on the Kazons, the different Kazon sects, and
Yeah.
they're in conflict with them. So they've, the ship's really been damaged and so forth, and they figure that Chakotay says maybe we need to take a Maquis approach and form an alliance with some of the Kazon
Right.
sects. And it turned they so Janeway is convinced to do that. They try it, and it totally blows up because they
Right.
also get it. I think the Trabe, they form an alliance with the Trabe, and they find out they're just as untrustworthy as the Kazons. So
Right.
the end of the episode is Janeway saying to her senior staff is, we need to, we kind of diverge from Federation principles. We need to stick with those principles.
Yes.
So, that's not, I mean, they're not in a position, the Voyager's not in a position to try to impose Federation mores and culture in the Delta Quadrant, but they're going to stick to
Very
that.
true.
So I think that, but if they had the opportunity, but what's happened in the Alpha Quadrant is the Federation, when we know they do colonize M-class planets and so forth that are uninhabited, in some cases terraform them and so forth, there is a certain, because there's this need to explore, there's this need to expand, which is another big conversation about, you know, do we need to do that as humans, or do we just need to live in balance with nature on the planet, which gets back to the climate change thing? You know, it is there a certain amount of geopolitical and cultural imperialism that the Federation, just by its nature, expresses?
Well, kind of shifting from the question of whether the Federation is expressing cultural imperialism to our real world, I think that every major power in some way is trying to express some sort of cultural imperialism now. Um, I think one of the downfalls, and you and I have talked about my leftist politics a lot. I think one of the downfalls that we on the left have really kind of embraced is this idea that we are anti-imperialists, but like that's like you can only be so much of an anti-capitalist on your iPhone, you know? You can only be so much of an anti-imperialist when you're living in America, which is, as far as I'm concerned, an imperialistic nation, especially after the failures of Afghanistan and Iraq. Because as you mentioned, we have to really identify what at least the publicly stated goal was of the Afghanistan mission. We can talk about WMDs. We can talk about whether or not the Afghani government was harboring Al Qaeda, which they were to a point, but then Al Qaeda went to Pakistan. Um, at the end of the day, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and the Bush administration tried to make the argument that somehow they were spreading American democracy and Western values to that region. That in itself is the textbook definition of what the British did, what the Romans did. Um, any sort of imperialistic nation that has gone out and conquered lands and acquired lands and annexed them into a greater body, all of them have made that argument that they are spreading they're spreading their way of life because to them, spreading that way of life is going to guarantee some sort of global or whole stability that you know the realm would not have otherwise.
There's, one of the things you and I've talked about is that I've resubscribed, about maybe 6, 8 months ago now to The Economist,
Right.
which I've enjoyed over the years very much. And I'm getting the actual hard copy magazines. And once I finish with them, I'm going to, put them in a package and mail them to you so you can peruse them. And I read an article just a couple of days ago about, it was one of the major, articles about countries that don't treat women fairly are bound to fail.
Right.
And then
Oh
there was
yeah.
an expanded article talking about how in the Middle East, there's it's just crazy the way brides are done and women have no role. And it talked about,
Oh, the brutality.
the Shiite in southern Iraq around Basra. And, I read that and it's like, I had no idea. I know that they didn't respect women, but I didn't know that they mistreated them this badly. And
Well,
just reading that article made me think there was no way when you have that sort of, different treatment of a gender compared to what, we have here. I mean,
which isn't perfect.
which is not perfect, but and there's a chart. There was somebody from a US and some other foreign university who did a study. They did a graph as to, who's good and who's bad. And like, I think Sweden is the best and the
Yeah.
US is really good. But then Saudi Arabia and Iraq and places like that, forget it. And once I read
Well,
that article about how the women are so brutally treated, there's no way that you can have democracy in a country, in a society like that.
let me put it in this perspective because I don't want anyone at home to think Jake or I are Islamophobic in any way.
No, no, not at all.
Uh, a lot of the Muslim refugees and immigrants that come here, like I said last episode, are coming here so they can join move into a good community, educate their kids, get jobs, pay bills, and then touch their head towards Mecca 5 times a day and just, live their lives in dignity. A lot of them are coming to this country because, uh, okay, there's a man down my street. I'm not going to give his name, but he's down my street in New York, and I talk to him every week. Um, he came here from Syria because he didn't want his daughter sold into slavery. And that was a sincere worry for him in Syria that he's like, I didn't have to worry about it here. And like, it's not a story that he's making up. There is, okay, you and I, there was a possibility that you were going to be going to Saudi Arabia recently. Thankfully, that's not happening, but one of the things that I remember from college when I took my 2 courses of Arabic was a lot of the kids in that class were from Saudi Arabia, and I would hang out with them after class. And one thing that they would constantly tell me about, especially young men, which was fascinating, there would be young men from Saudi Arabia. I remember one of them. I think his name was Saddam, actually. But he was from Saudi Arabia. He was from Riyadh. He was probably like 27 years old and had just started college because even in Saudi Arabia, like getting into school, that's something you don't do unless you have money. Here, he was able to take his money that he earned driving a cab and I think he told me he drove a cab in Dubai and made enough money to come to America and get into college at 27. He couldn't do that in Saudi Arabia. And then he talked about like how hard it was for him to come from Saudi Arabia and then like try to get a girlfriend because he had been raised in this culture where you're able to treat women a certain way and he suddenly realized like he couldn't do that over here. For example, everyone talks about how the Saudi Arabian government under God Malik uh Saudi royal prince. I need to look up his name.
So the royal guy, the current guy,
Yeah,
Mohammed bin Salman.
yeah,
M.
Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud.
Yes.
Yes. Um, Everyone was talking for a while about how he was going to be this great democratic reformer,
Right.
but we have to put this in perspective. After he killed Kamal Khashoggi, folks, who was a U.S. based journalist, that I have to say the Biden administration didn't do.
A U.S. Saudi dual citizen.
A U.S. Saudi dual citizen, but he was still one of ours. God damn it! Um, one thing that Saudi women aren't allowed to do for a long time was go out into public with without a male chaperone. And it usually had to be their father or brother. It couldn't be like, a friend or a cousin or something like that because there was a worry that there would be some impropriety. But the recent thing that they're celebrating now, which drives me crazy if you think about it, women are now allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, and that's the big new thing over there. But while everyone's celebrating, they're forgetting that these women still have to drive with male chaperones present. And this is the light, and in terms of that region, um, that is a relatively liberalized area for the region because, like, if you go into Syria, women are treated very poorly in Syria, especially now, since out, but
ISIS.
what,
Yeah.
yeah, since they have basically taken power, um, there's very few places in the Middle East where women can get the sort of treatment. Again, I'm not saying America and the West are perfect, but compared, like, it's far and away better to be here in America and to be a young Muslim woman in the West than it is to be a young Muslim woman in the Middle East, which is essentially what I'm getting at. Um, it's just a completely different sort of that. It's a different sort of value set, and I think this is where we can actually. May seem inappropriate. I don't want to compare the Taliban to the Shellyak, but I'm going to. Um, Okay, let's and I'm going to shit on Joe Biden with this example, but I have to. So if Captain Picard was suddenly president of the United States in 2021, and he saw that we were leaving behind Americans and American allies who helped our troops in terms of things like Arabic interpretation, cultural penetration, just keeping our troops safe. um this entire idea that I need to have 3 weeks to get the proper ships needed to get all of these people out. He would fight tooth and nail to get all of those people
He would
out.
have figured out how to somehow get around whatever agreement the previous administration made with the Taliban so that the Grisellans would
Right.
become involved, which
but
would
like
give him
but
more time.
but the problem is, like, the Taliban really are the Shellyak. The Shellyak are going to come in and wipe everyone out that stands in their way. I mean, it really is a pretty good allusion, this story, to what we're dealing with now in Afghanistan. There is a contingent of people in Afghanistan who feel like they worked so hard over the last 20 years to build some sort of stable democracy, and to watch it all basically be blown away in a matter of days. It's been a few months now since it happened, but to watch all that democracy get blown away in a matter of days, it's very telling how the balances of empire really do fall on often the innocent more than it actually does the people in who are making the decisions.
And it gets back to what we're talking about, where the humans that have adapted to the radiation on Tau Sigma 5 don't understand the environment in which they really exist. And as you said, there were people that worked with the US and the British and the French and the other NATO nations that went in there with us to try to modernize Afghanistan. And there was a lot of on the surface progress made. However,
Oh yeah.
the basic political structure, um, did not change, and we could not change it because everything was built on corruption. It was built on tribalism. The warlords that uh, came to fore after the Soviets left and so forth. They didn't go away. They were just there biding their time, just like the Taliban. So it
Well,
was like, so it's sort of like, everything we tried to do, it goes back to kind of the lessons that are being already learned. Like, you know, we talked about, I think last episode, once we went into Afghanistan, particularly when we went to Afghanistan, there was supposedly, from these kind of like Afghanistan papers type thing, that one journalist wrote a book on it, that even Rumsfeld said, all right, now that we're there,
Rumsfeld, yeah,
how are we going to get out? And
yeah.
they never answered the question. And they took the neo-conservative approach. Well, we'll make them a Western-like democracy. And then once it was decided to go into Iraq, well, we'll do the same thing there, since we got rid of the Taliban, we'll get rid of Saddam Hussein, and we'll fix Afghanistan this way, and we'll fix Iraq that way. And
Well, if you,
there were just essential
yeah.
things there that weren't going to change as to why this approach didn't work.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the fact that like how approaches have to change and how approaches don't work because there's a roundabout way Data's story fits into this. So like, Data goes down to the planet and he basically warns them first. And then he tries to do multiple attempts to like persuade people. Riker explains how to Data when Data's first dealing with Goshevin that like you have to be able to deal with the challenges on the fly, which means you're going to have to be able to change your tactics in dealing with Goshevin. And there's a lot of things that they try reverse psychology, they try appealing to him on an emotional basis, to the point where they even start trying to split up the community by going to Kentor, who apparently has some political power in his society, with the idea that, like, oh, we'll get Kentor to stand against Goshevin, and then Kentor will force us to get off the planet. Um, Interestingly, Goshevin is the one that chooses to use violence against Data when he realizes that Data is not going to relent. And and this is the roundabout way, Data has to learn to adjust his tactics, as Riker says, learn on the fly in these tactical situations. And it's interesting the kind of sociological thing that happens here. And it happens in narrative all the time. And I think it's part of general storytelling, but I think it's also part of human psychology. The moment violence is introduced, it becomes immediately permissive. Like the moment Data is incapacitated, I think by that kind of electromagnetic stick that Goshevin uses to essentially put him to sleep. When he wakes up, his first thought is, okay, this guy's willing to hurt me. I need to arm up. And he basically goes and modifies a phaser using his own circuitry. Um, and then goes and this is the big thing that we've been waiting to reveal. He goes and destroys the aqueduct that Goshevin had kind of fetishized at the beginning of the episode,
Yes.
being like, this is the thing that we brought water from the desert. He destroys the water from the desert. And I just find it interesting how violence, when it's introduced into a situation, immediately becomes almost the de facto decision maker in many cases. I was wondering if you had any kind of, you know, reflections on how Data initially approaches Goshevin and the multiple things he does versus, what he ultimately ends up having to do when it comes to violence. Just what do you think about that kind of transition in terms of the
I,
story being
I
told?
think I think you describe it well in that, um, Data being strongly logical, is sort of having understanding humans, but having a limited understanding. Really, he tries to take a logical, benign approach. And, it gets to the point where Goshevin perpetrates a violent act toward Data, then a line is crossed. It's like, I forget who the man was in the UK in London who, his name Robert or something, came up with the bobbies back in the
Right,
19th century, and he said they're not going to carry weapons because violence begets violence. So I
right.
think you said a very important thing is that, as soon as somebody becomes violent, a line is crossed, and, the person who that the violence is perpetrated against, they immediately can elect to stand down so that it doesn't become a vicious cycle, or they will counter coup, and then you're into it with one another.
Well, Data immediately goes into a counter coup. It's not, he doesn't stand down immediately. He immediately goes, okay, if this guy wants to get this
He
excessive, I in a way have to get excessive as well.
he adjusts his tactics, right?
Do you think that that is an appropriate human response, or do you think that that is something left over from our time evolving over the last 10,000 years from hunter gatherers that is something that we need to get rid of? Or is there a value in terms of having that kind of ability to escalate after violence has been done to you? Like, I guess the weird thing I'm asking is like, is this an evolutionary quirk that's good, or is it an evolutionary quirk that we need to get rid of?
Well, I think in this case, it's really, you know, it's part of Data adapting his tactics to the situation because he realized that he had to do,
Right.
something to really shock and awe Goshevin and the colonists, or the not
It's funny
colonists.
that you use that term.
Yeah, yeah, and he has to shock and awe them so that he realizes, like, hey, this phaser I've adapted is more powerful than any weapon you have. The Shellyak are going to come in hundreds, and their weapons are going to be infinitely much more powerful. So you don't stand a chance. You really will be obliterated. And at that point, that physical demonstration convinces everybody, okay, we need to get the hell out of here.
See, to me though, this is the proof to me that Starfleet, when it needs to be, will rely on kind of an imperialistic viewpoint of, hey, look, um, it must be very much like Cortez. Like Cortez probably showed up in Mexico, and the Aztecs said, like, hey, this is our land, and Cortez like, yeah, but this is my gun. Um,
I have horses, guns, and cannons, right?
yes, you have sticks in your feet.
And my and
Um,
my men are well motivated.
yes. Um, I think that is, I find it to be a little disturbing when I think about how even in the 24th century we haven't really evolved past. And you mentioned it before, there is that choice to stand down. There hasn't We're still in the process of learning how to stand down. And it's Goshevin who has to learn to stand down, not Data. But because of what Goshevin does, violence is just the outcome.
Maybe we are learning, but it's in the context of our ability to potentially annihilate ourselves with nuclear weapons. Because during the Cuban
Hmm.
Missile Crisis, there's a story that there was a Soviet submarine commander that was going to torpedo, I think it was a destroyer, the Joseph P. Kennedy, the destroyer that was named for
Mm-hmm.
Jack Kennedy's father. And he chose not to because he knew that that would cause a cascade of events that would probably result in nuclear war. There was an incident in the 80s where there was a Soviet um, early warning system malfunction that indicated that the U.S. was doing a first strike nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. And there was a general who just had the gut feel like, this just isn't right. I'm not going to throw the switch. I'm going to wait and verify what's going on. And
Right.
somehow he found that there wasn't an attack. I don't know whether, he called Moscow and whether the hotline was used or whatever. And then, again, with kind of learning, trying to evolve so that we don't get into this, first strike violence. I mean, just what happened supposedly, you know, around January 6th, where General Milley called his counterpart in China. And,
Hmm.
again, one of the things that's put in the context with that call, there's a lot of criticism of Milley, but there are contacts at back channel contacts among military adversaries that have gone on for years to try to
Oh,
keep to,
centuries. Yeah.
centuries to try to keep a lid on things. People trying to not go into a total mode of mutual self-destruction, which is what kept the nuclear peace mutually assured destruction.
Right. Well, I think, and it's funny that you bring up the Millie situation because I think what people don't I don't think people underestimate the willingness for people to go out of their way and do something crazy in the pursuit of what they think is the right thing to do. Um, General Milley, in many ways, what he could have done would have been looked at like a huge breach of security, many moral and ethical questions towards what he did. But the reason why there isn't real moral and ethical questions versus what he did is because he was scared about the nation and he was scared about the state of which America was going, and he thought that there was going to be a tyrannical coup. And he had to prepare for the idea that, like, to save my country, my democracy, I might have to organize something to bring this guy down. That is a very that's such a psychologically fucked up place to be, I think, for a general who's been serving his country for decades to suddenly have to think, like, I actually have to put together a coup against a standing president. Um, it, I can only imagine the thoughts that go through one's head. At the same time, like, getting back a little bit to Data and how Data responds to Goshevin after Goshevin uses violence. Data is struck with doubt throughout this episode that he is able to actually convince Goshevin or any of the other colonists. And I think once Goshevin perpetuates violence against Data or performs violence against Data, I think Data's adjustment is not necessarily born out of this idea I have to get Goshevin back or I have to punish Goshevin for what he did to me. It's just the situation is so dangerous now that I have to take drastic actions if I'm going to save these 15,000 people from being annihilated. In many ways, I think General Milley probably looked around and said, like, this is a country of almost 400 million people that rely on a democracy to keep it all together. I might have to do something drastic to keep it all together. And I think there's a place where, getting back to my question, is this an evolutionary quirk that we need to keep or get rid of? I, I think maybe my question is a mute point because it depends on the situation. And I think it gets back to what Riker says. You really do have to work on the fly, and sometimes working on the fly means being willing to go meet the level that someone escalates things to.
I think it depends upon not just the situation, but the person. Because
Right.
suppose the Soviet submarine commander was just a total, communist,
Anti-American, yeah.
anti-American, or the general who, was looking at the possibility of an American first strike on the Soviet Union. If he would have been a hair trigger guy and not thought through things, we may not be talking right now at all.
Right.
And so, and that gets into, gets the other thing is like, what determines our fate as a species? Is it just
Oh
luck?
yeah.
Is it God? What prevents that sort of thing? What
I
what
think
what what caused Hitler to make 20 different mistakes so that he lost a war that he really should have won?
right. What caught? Oh yeah. Oh, what causes Rome to fall down despite like holding back several invasions from the east that they successfully held back? There's so many questions that you can ask throughout history that, why did this happen? I think you know, I'm always trying to go back to the episode, it seems, in this recording, but I think what ultimately happens is when Data and Goshfin have their final reckoning and Data uses the phaser to destroy the aqueduct, I think Goshevin is at least evolved enough to realize, like, okay, this thing that I have is gone. My argument that somehow I'm going to be able to keep this place going despite the challenges that are arising against us has disappeared. Um, I think the hope is that at some point we will see such a stark truth that even our egos won't be able to defeat it, and that we'll be able to accept it. I think that is ultimately, I think, the hope. And getting, whether it's to climate change or realizing that, getting into irregular wars is probably not a smart thing for a nation to do.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, just I think they're trying to realize that we've had this pandemic. We're not out of it. There's going to be pandemics in the future that we have to deal with a global pandemic truly on a global basis in the future because we're not now at all.
right. Well, I think what the writers of this episode are trying to point out is that, this entire idea of having this materialistic world that never changes is ultimately just a fallacy and an illusion that will cause you a greater downfall than being willing to see that, like, there's other options out there. And even like the other colonists at one point, Kentor takes charge and he's like, there's other challenges, there's other places to build before he storms off. I think that's it's so hard to let go of something that we've built and that we've put so much of our blood and sweat into. And even Goshevin says, like, this isn't water, this is blood, this is
Right.
sweat, this is our
Right.
tears.
Yeah.
I think I think the writers of Star Trek are saying that that is such an old way of thinking that if we really are to move on to something better, we have to be able to let go of that ownership of the past. And I think that is a huge hurdle that we're still dealing with here in America, especially in the wake of things like Afghanistan, and Iraq. You and I have talked about Vietnam on the show before, but America's moral and ethic really did change after we ended Vietnam. It really did become a little bit more dour, a little bit more depressed. Like, as you know, Jimmy Carter did say there was a great malaise in America, but that's because we had lost thousands of troops and we had lost war from everyone else's perspective.
And the economy wasn't doing well and so on. Sure.
Right. Um, I think I think that if we had had a discussion, well, I don't. I think we need to have a discussion now about how to properly move on as a nation emotionally and psychologically from Iraq and Afghanistan if we're going to not only learn the lessons from it but actually not be brought down or brought lower by it.
Oh, what? Not only that, I think we have to be able to um, look at where we are psychologically and emotionally as to how there are different views of what democracy is in this country.
Right. Well, I'm at the point now that I'm doing a lot of reading on the alternatives to capitalism. Because honestly, I don't think that communism or even socialism are going to offer the outcomes that we're looking for. I think that we're going to have to come up with a completely new system that there might be an idea already out there, but like no one's heard it yet.
Well, on that note, let me shift to one thing I made a note about that I thought was significant in this episode, getting back to
Right.
the whole Shellyak issue, and um, you this treaty is 500,000 words, and
Right.
Troy notes to Picard that there were like 360 different legal personnel, Federation legal, that were involved in the treaty, and how are we going to deal with the Shellyak when it's just who's going to be the legal experts? And very cutely, Picard says to Troy, "thee and me." So at one point,
Yeah.
they're in his ready room, and Troy says to him, "The fact that any alien race communicates with another is quite remarkable." And there's
Oh
a
yeah.
little discussion about that in terms of throwing out some words and what it means and so forth. And it's something. The reason I wrote the note is something we talked about before. Is if there really ever is a first contact, you know,
Hmm.
how would it really work? Because we've talked about Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where it's through music. Um, there's the Jodie Foster movie with Contact, which is very difficult to explain. It's like engineering and math, and then you have The Arrival with what's her name, Amy,
Amy
whatever,
Adams.
Amy Adams, where it's kind of a graphic language, and and the communication was all different, and it kind of gets into with the partisan divides and the cultural divides we have,
Oh yeah.
not just in this country but globally, just in terms of Western democracies, lumped together with the Taliban. How do you communicate with these people? Because it's just not a matter of language; it's a matter of how you think. So,
I think so. I have an interesting answer to that, so I'll include a link in the description. There's this new YouTube channel called Tribal Peoples, and
mhm.
essentially what they do is they go to the Middle East and they go to actual tribal peoples in like Pakistan and
Oh, I've
Afghanistan.
seen this. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
they have them like watch American and Western television and ceremonies and stuff like that. They have one where they watch Charlie Chaplin's speech from the
yeah,
Great Dictator,
right.
and it's fascinating to watch them watch that speech from the Great Dictator because on one hand, some of them are a little turned off by Chaplin becoming so emotional about things. Like they're like he's angry, but on the other hand, every single one of them sat there and they're like, well, look what he's talking about. He's talking about us not being co-opted into violence and believing that like love can't solve things. Arguing for peace, and that there's one Sufi in the group who is literally like, apparently he is an actual soldier out in the desert, and he's sitting there and he's watching this and he's like, this man has seen God because he realizes that after going to war he doesn't want to go to war anymore, because like this tribesman from the desert is probably not recognizing that like Charlie Chaplin's just playing a character.
Mm.
He probably thinks like, no, this soldier has seen war and he now realizes he doesn't want to kill anymore. I think the Rosetta Stone that we need the world over is probably going to be an emotional one. Like, we need to be able to show people that we all suffer in similar ways. Like, even that tribesman who, I have a mother that one day is going to pass from this earth. That tribesman may have a mother, or may have had a mother who has already passed from this earth. Either way, we are both bound by the love that we have for our mothers and the sorrow that we will feel at their passing. That is something that me and that tribesman need to be able to communicate with each other on. That we both feel those same things and thoughts of love towards our mother or our fathers or our wives or whatever, and we need to be able to see that similarity in each other. And maybe we can understand each other's worldview, and we can't understand each other's politics or even the cultures that we come from. But if we can understand that, like, he's a human being on the basis that he loves other human beings and he has values that he's willing to defend, and that he understands that I love beings and that I have values that I'm willing to defend, and that many of those values may actually come together between he and I. Like, I think that's the Rosetta Stone that we're probably going to need in this world.
It's almost like you have to have certain religious philosophies, like what Jesus
A little bit,
represents,
yeah.
what the Bhagavad Gita says, and either if you read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, the story of
Oh,
Buddha,
yeah.
if you could combine those all together and get somebody to have an emotional response to the areas where those three stories intersect, that's what needs to happen.
So, getting back to the great dictator, and I've mentioned him a lot this season already, but also Albert Camus. One thing that Camus talks about is the worst thing that you can do is fall into nihilism. And even though we have this kind of silent, chaotic universe that makes no sense and has no inherent meaning, it's the meaning that we make that matters. And that if we make things that have a positive meaning and come from a place of love, we will make a universe that is full of meaning and love. Um,
This
that
this
may sound
this
like,
this is too hard to shut down. Also,
yes, exactly. Um, good reference. No one ever mentions him. Um, but I think that you have to somehow also get that tribesman or that person that Trump voter across the aisle. We both have to look at the world and have a sense of unified vision where it's going. We both have to feel like there's hope or there's some
hmm
positivity in working on this together. Because, if you have one side, and this is really my main criticism of the right here in America. You know how I just said, like, the worst thing that you can do is, worst thing Camus says that you can do is embrace nihilism or nihilism. The right here in America has completely embraced nihilism and nihilism.
hmm
They constantly attack the left and say that, like, we're the ones who are saying that everything's morally relativistic and life has no inherent value. But if you look at the more, the moral, the moving of the moral and ethical goalposts that the right are constantly up to, like, if anyone's morally relativistic, it literally is the Trump voter. Like, you can't say on one hand, like, you respect women and their rights, and then turn around and support a candidate that has been openly misogynistic, openly predatory. Like, you have to have a mindset that, like, things don't matter and people are allowed to get away with whatever they want,
and
or
what
you
you're
have to.
and what you're
Yeah,
describing is being woke.
yeah. But at the same time, like, on the other hand, you can't have this idea that, you know, if people don't adhere exactly to your moral and ethical values, they're somehow demons. But that's
hmm
the other half of this.
hmm
Like, you both have to be able to look across the room and say, like, okay, this person may not believe everything that I believe in, but if we work together, we can at least move forward in a way where we're not killing each other at the end of this, and we may even be in a better place than where we
Yes.
began.
Yeah.
And I think that
Absolutely.
that's just the Rosetta Stone that we need to figure out for that really is connecting people to the idea that we share values still. And I think that's the problem in America now. We don't have any quote unquote shared values, which I don't think is true. I think the problem is, like, we have present. I think the media and our body politic and
And
our
social
in our
media.
and social media, I definitely social media. I think they present this idea that there is no such thing as commonality anymore, that we are all split into these niches.
Right. Yes.
And like
Agree.
that's just not true because like we still have the basic commonality of hopefully being human beings.
Yes.
Um and on that, like let's transition to the other half of this episode because we've dealt a lot with at the Tau Sigma 5 folks. Let's transition to the Shellyak real quick and Picard's storyline. So the Shellyak corporate I find interesting. Just the idea that you kind of have this insectoid race, it seems, that looks like. So the idea of a corporate, it seems a lot like an ant colony.
Yeah, I have not figured out what the Shellyak are.
I think the Shellyak are some sort of insectoid type of species in the galaxy that have pretty brutal technology, but they're probably like they're probably an intergalactic ant colony
Hmm.
essentially. And they probably have queens and drones and stuff like that, and they're carrying broods of eggs. You know, for an alien, they are just they're kind of just built to be like really bureaucratic by the book assholes. Beyond that, like we don't really get much in the way of physical or kind of
Mm-mm.
biological behavioral patterns
Right. Right.
in a sense.
Right.
Um, One thing though that I find interesting is that they are so bound by um, their own set of laws as it's codified in terms of the agreements they make. It surprised me that Picard was able to get over on them so easily that they wouldn't think like, this guy has. And it's kind of the cheap part of the episode on Picard's side. He spends this entire episode being like, "What do I do? What do I do? What do I do?" And all he has to do is call for arbitration. Like, um, however, I think the thing about this side of the storyline is that the acting is so good. Where like the acting down in Tau Sigma 5 is just so bad. And I was wondering, what do you think of this half of the episode? For Picard and Troy working through all their
I,
problems with the Shellyak.
I think that, since the treaty is 500,000 words, it makes me think of a lesson I learned that when you read like federal government documents and federal regulations, somebody said, read with intent. So if you
Right.
know exactly what you're looking for, you can actually get through these very verbose
Mm-hmm.
documents, like the Federal Register, quickly. Um, but it just like if it's that large of a document, it would be surprising to me if Picard could read with intent and all of a sudden find that that arbitration, that third party arbitration, so quickly. Um,
Can I so a lot of people probably don't know this, but one of the former things I did before becoming an author, I actually worked as an information operations manager for a large corporate immigration law firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one of the things that I started noticing, lawyers and paralegals have to go through a large amount of material to research their cases and make their matters cogent before a judge so, they can convince them of what they want them to do. Uh, One thing that I saw before I left was how AI was slowly being talked about in the legal fields.
mhm.
And one of the things that, you brought up, like, if Picard wanted to, he could focus down and go
Mm.
through this 500,000 word document. But it seems to me that, like, the easiest thing they could do in the world is that you go, like, computer, find me some sort of legal out on this that I can, like, can I call for arbitration? What are my options in this case? And it seems to me like the computer would have the AI to
Yeah,
help him figure that out.
yeah, for sure. That's a good point.
Because they're developing that technology right here
Yes,
in 2021 now,
right.
where there's a worry that it's going to get rid of you'll be able to reduce your paralegal staff by a large percentage because they won't have to be spending hours looking up material. It'll all just be brought up by an AI.
We have a great idea. Let's get AI to rewrite the tax code to make
They
it
are,
logical.
I, Dad, I am not joking. That
to
is one
get
of
to
the
get
things that
to get rid of all the crap and shit in there.
the IRS wants to start implementing AI as a way to modernize their tax services and actually go after tax cheats. And
Right.
they're probably going to have to because they're so technologically backwards.
Yes.
But I think that this is also a reflection of 1989 versus
Right.
2001.
That's a good point.
The writers probably didn't really have any idea of an AI, or even the computer of the enterprise just looking up the
Right.
possibility of it just looking up this random bit of data that you ask it to,
Yep.
and it just going bloop. We have the ability to go bloop now. Um, do you think that Picard's I kind of want to get back to the discussion of the fact that any alien race communicates at all being quite remarkable. I do find that idea fascinating, and I think when Deanna uses the illusion of Picard's teacup, like,
Hmm.
tell me what this is. Is it brown? Is it liquid? Is it hot? Uh, One thing that I found to be a little bit of a problem with that scene is that, like, you have a universal translator. Does that really matter when you have this thing on the bridge that basically converts all the language the Shellyak are blurting at you into English?
Hmm.
Um, you know, you mentioned you mentioned Arrival and Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Contact, and I love Contact, by the way, which was based off of Carl Sagan novel, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
Sagan had some very interesting ideas about how aliens would communicate with us. And he thought that it would probably be, using math and kind of scientific notation, but it would also be um, telepathic and multidimensional. Like,
Hmm.
Sagan was a big believer that aliens would be multidimensional if we ran into them,
Hmm.
or temporal as well. He thought if aliens had developed the ability to travel, he suspected that they would probably develop something like wormholes. And then he really got into the idea that, like, if we met aliens, we might not be meeting aliens in our time. Um, but on that aside, I think that having a universal translator is interesting in this case because, on one hand, the show's acting like it doesn't exist, but on the other hand, what does it mean if we have a technology like a universal translator and then we get into episodes like this where they're like, oh, but language matters? Um, do you think the moment everyone can understand each other because we have a piece of technology that basically converts all speech into something understandable, what do you think that does to our language?
Yeah, I mean, it's good that you bring up the concept of the universal translator because you can translate, try to figure out words in terms of what their meaning is, but there's so much in terms of syntax, how things are put together, and so forth. I don't know how a universal translator could pick up those nuances and
Right.
convert them into another language. So the idea of university translator shows up a lot in different science fiction stories, but when you get right down to it, is it really just nothing more than science fiction?
Well, I thought they handled it very well in Enterprise with Ensign Hoshisato. Was that her
Yeah,
name?
yeah,
Well, like, they didn't really. They had a universal translator, but they also had to have her there to translate what aliens were
exactly.
saying
Right.
because the universal translator hadn't picked up that many languages yet. I think I think the idea of it being science fiction is not that far fetched. Um, I think it is something that we will produce soon. I mean, we kind of already have it at like the UN meetings when they have those headpieces.
Oh
Like
yeah,
they're
well
hooked up to a
you've
translator.
got some of that with Google Translate now.
Yeah, that's true as well. And I think if you start incorporating AI with that, um, I I can definitely see a future where if we integrate AI into some sort of, I'm talking about cybernetics. If we integrate AI into our biological system as a human being, I can see a universal translator option to where, like, you meet someone who, let's say you're a tourist in China and you don't speak a word of Chinese, but you walk up to someone in China and you both have like, and I know I'm going to be using Google, and hopefully Google isn't around when this happens. I hope not. But like, let's say you both have the Google chip in your head, and he says something to you in Cantonese, and you can't understand a word of Cantonese, but let's say you have a heads up display across your retina, or across your cornea, and a screen pops up on your cornea, and it translates to what he says. It says, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And then you can shout back into to him in English, like, "I'm lost," and it'll pop up in Chinese on his heads up display. "Oh, this American's lost." And like maybe that will be the kind of early, I'm sorry, the early version of a universal translator, at least here among humans.
Sure.
um
Okay. Yeah.
but I would have to imagine, like, it's possible. It's just, you do a lot of Duolingo. um that learning a language, well, you're learning a language right now. What do you think of a universal translator as it goes towards learning a language?
I think if you look at just Duolingo, the way it tries to teach you, it actually does a pretty good job on that area.
Hmm. But do you think if you had something like a universal translator, where if you were in Germany and you knew what people were saying in Germany because it was translated for you, do you still think that you would want to learn German and still want to learn to speak German?
I I I think I would
If everyone had
because
the ability to understand each other but didn't have to put in the work of like learning a language, would you still want to learn the language? Is essentially what I'm asking.
at this point I would say yes because there's so much nuance and uh,
Right.
what's the right one? The dialects. Just different dialects in America, or different dialects in the UK, or different dialects in Germany, or the words that they're using Austrian German versus Bavarian German versus North German, or the good thing about I think there's some truth to it in Inglorious Bastards, where the bar scene and the Gestapo guys
Yes.
said, "Oh, you're from Frankfurt, you're from Berlin," and blah blah blah, all this sort of thing. I think when you learn a language, because one of the things I'm doing with Duolingo German is you have to have the ear for it also.
Hmm.
You have to be, they just put in this new guy that has this very heavy German accent. And at first, I was not able to understand some of his words. And now that I've gotten used to him, because I have to develop that ear. And I don't know
Right.
enough. It might be a certain dialect that he's
Well, it's
demonstrating.
funny that you mention it, because one of the things that they do in the original series and in the reboot films when it comes to Uhura is that they really highlight how she really has an ear for these languages. And
Yes,
it's not just her skill in being able to translate and speak these languages. She's able to hear nuances that other
exactly.
people can't. So, and even then, they have a universal translator too.
Oh, there was a great story on 60 Minutes recently about the Ritchie boys during World War II.
Right.
And just so everybody knows, there was a bunch of young men who were Germans who had immigrated to the United States before America became involved in the war. Many of them were Jewish, German
Hmm.
Jews who escaped the Nazis. And they joined the Army and they were put into a special school out in the Maryland mountains and taught to be interrogators. And they were highly successful because they would capture German soldiers, German officers, and they'd put them in a room or a tent. And here's a guy that grew up in Frankfurt, and he could talk about, the Bundesliga soccer team and the food. And it just was shocking to these German soldiers that there were, American interrogators that knew Frankfurtese or Berlinese and
Mm-hmm.
so forth. It just put these Germans in a comfort zone where they would open up and they would reveal a lot of military intelligence.
Right. Well, like there's a real, as you highlighted, there's a real talent in being able to go in and blend with the locals, and blending with the locals is really being able to speak their language.
Yes.
Like ultimately, you can dress like them, you can eat like them, but until you talk like them, like it means nothing.
It just isn't the words, right?
So, I think we've had a great episode tonight.
Yeah.
Let's finish up on a few fun things. So, Jordy is given this task of trying to get past the hyperonic radiation and beam things up, and it's just very clear that he can't. I really like both of those scenes, especially when he finally comes to Picard. He's like, "I can do it. It'll just take me 15 years." I kind of love the intrepidness of Starfleet officers.
Right. Right.
Like I'm not giving up, but you're gonna have to give me more time. Um, so the actor who plays who plays the Shellyak representative is Mark McChesney, who also played Aramis, who kills Tasha Yar.
Yes. Yes.
I have to put this link in, but like so on Star Trek fan memes, there is a theme now called Blazing Bev, and have you seen any of these?
No.
I may have
No.
shared them on my Facebook. So the idea of these memes is that Dr. Beverly Crusher is not only the chief medical officer on the USS Enterprise D, she is also the main weed grower and dealer upon the Enterprise D as well. And um, one one meme is that John Luke Picard is sitting in the wedding room and he has a joint,
Oh,
and
yes. I've
essentially
seen
he's
that.
like, I smoke a little bit of the Armistar every year to commemorate Tasha Yar,
Right.
but I forgot what day she died on, so I smoke a little bit every day just in case.
Right. Exactly. I
I
remember seeing
saw
that.
that note. I saw that note, and I thought immediately of that. So,
Oh, the other
uh,
fun thing was uh, Ardrian, the uh,
if
Tau
you want to
Sigma
call
5
her that,
woman who's really, it's one of the things that pops up in Star Trek now and then of the, um, one alien having this sort of sexual fantasy of falling in love with another alien.
this is Rick Berman. This is Rick Berman.
It shows up in one future episode where Riker's, been surgically altered and he gets injured on a planet, and this nurse says, "I'll help you escape if you make love to me." And
And he does.
yeah, he does. And Adrienne doesn't go that far, but she is enamored of this hyper intelligent android, which is so advanced beyond what what she's been uh, working on. And then the other thing I think is really
She
good.
clearly has she clearly has an attraction to him.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's really kind of
Which
funny at the end where Data's humanness, where she's saying goodbye to him, and he kisses her and says, why did you do that? It looked like you needed it, which was a turnabout from what she had when she had kissed him before, when he was trying to figure out, how am I going to solve this thing.
well, they try to play with a lot of interesting like Wild West tropes in this episode when it comes to
Uh-huh.
Data, like getting the girl, facing off against the town,
Right.
going up against the boss, all sorts of those things. But I think it's just so awkwardly delivered, And the actress who plays Adrian, like, she's a great actress. I've seen her in other things. I
Yeah.
think she was in Airplane. Um, yeah, Eileen Seeley, who plays Adrian McKenzie. Like, I found her creepy. I thought she was always trying to get with Data, and it just this is one of those things where it's like Rick Berman has a very interesting idea about how women see men, and in
Huh.
turn how men see women. Like this kind of weirdly one-sided sexualization. Um, but I have to say, her character is the biggest turnoff for me in this episode.
Yeah, it's like, come on now. Exactly. I had the same
Yeah.
reaction. Now the
Well,
other good. Go ahead.
sorry. The place that I wanted to kind of finish this off though is when Data finally gets back aboard the Enterprise. He goes to his debriefing with Jean-Luc
Oh yes.
Picard, and they have this discussion about Picard basically is listening to Data's performance from 10 forward because he had Crusher actually make a recording for him, which is a very sweet thing. It's very, your dad wasn't able to be at the game, but he taped the game so he can watch it later. Like, that's actually kind of nice. Um, but one thing that he does is he compliments Data. And he's like, there's a lot of liveliness to your playing. And Data once again tries to deny it, saying, like, I took this composer and that composer and this performer and kind of blended them all together. And that's not really creativity, that's just mimicry. But Card is the first one to point out, like, no, that is creativity because we don't ever start raw or from a place of zero. We always have some sort of influence that comes beforehand that teaches us and shows us how to do something so we can therefore go and change it later on. I think that this is a great expression of what this episode's been about in terms of Data
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
learning how to be Picard in a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
learning how to be Riker a little bit, and then learning how to be himself.
Yeah.
And I was just
One last.
wondering what you thought. Yeah,
Go
sorry, go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ask your
Well,
question.
I just wanted to think of what you thought about this final lesson for the episode.
Oh, I thought it was very good. It was a good, um, just just a good, sort of counterpoint to the episode, how it started in 10 forward, comes back to, Data's, um, suggestion to Picard, like, well, you don't want to go to this performance, come to the next one because mine's not going to be that creative. And it just fits in with the process that Data went through while he was down on the planet, that he had to
Right,
be creative.
right.
The other thing I think
But
that you, go ahead.
sorry, go on. No, no,
The
go
other
on, go on.
the other thing I think that you mentioned about the good acting with the Shellyak deal was when Picard finally throws, the
Yeah,
arbitration with the Grisellas in the Shellяк's face, and then cuts them off and is walking around the bridge and even walks up to
it's
the
such a good
plaque and,
scene.
just sees where there's dust on the thing, and they're looking at him like, and Viker says at one point, "You're really enjoying this." He says, "You're damn right I am." And,
It's a
then
great scene.
finally, comes back on, and, I think there's a YouTube little episode that's just called "Picard Owns the Shellyak," and at
Oh
that
yeah,
point, he does. Yes.
it does. It's great. Oh,
Yeah.
before we go, what do you think of the collars on the uniforms?
The collars on the
The
uniforms.
season 3 is where they get the collars on the uniforms. They are no longer in the woolen jumpsuits. They have kind of like the shirt with the collars that have the pips on them.
Well, I have to pay attention to that. The one Star Trek fashion that I've always liked, and this might show up in the movies more than the television series. I always like when they have the traditional kind of shirt, and then sometimes they wear a jacket over it of a
Yeah.
different color. I always thought that is great. I'll have to pay attention to that more. And so ask me about that again.
Okay, I'll ask you
Ask
about it
me
next
about that
episode.
again. Yeah,
Well, Dad, thank you so much for joining us,
sure.
or joining me. I hope you had a good time. I
I
certainly
did.
did.
Yeah.
Um, Everyone, thank you for sitting with us as we discussed Ensigns of Command. We will be back next time for Star Trek: The Next Generations, Season 3, Episode 3, The Survivors. See you then, Dad.
Thanks, Jay.
Good night.